Hi everyone, you're so welcome. I'm just going to give it a minute as people join us. And then we will get started. Hi everyone, you're really welcome. We're going to kick off this webinar now in about a minute. There are 70 of you so far here, which is great. So you're really, really welcome. And we really appreciate you joining us on this really hot and sunny summer's evening to talk about this issue because it is really important. And I think it's going to be a really brilliant discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to just say hello to everyone. So we are recording this webinar, just to let you know. So we will have it available for playback over the next few days. There are still people coming in and joining us, so you're really welcome. But I'm just going to start introducing the theme of this evening and what we're doing tonight. And then I'm going to hand it over to our speakers, Patrick Brodie and Patrick Bresnihan, who are joining us. And we're really excited to hear from them. So just to introduce myself, my name is Rosie Leonard. I work as the Network Development Coordinator in Friends of the Earth Ireland. And I'm also joined by my colleague tonight, Emma Jane Garrity, who's the Head of Movement Building in Friends of the Earth Ireland. And for anyone who doesn't know who Friends of the Earth Ireland are, or if this is your first time joining us for a webinar, we are an NGO. We work as part of a wider federation of Friends of the Earth groups internationally. And we campaign for a planet where nature and people thrive. We work around the issue of climate justice, and we also work on the issue of social justice. And we see these things as quite fundamentally linked. And data centres are very much part of both of these issues, as we will explore later on tonight. So to give you a really, really quick introduction around why we're doing this webinar, we've been working on data centres in one form or another for about over a year now. We have had a lot of really interesting engagements with groups who have been working very much on the ground around data centres. And a lot of this work is building on the work that's already been done by groups like Not Here, Not Anywhere, groups like Shliela, who've been working on the kind of issues of data centres and how they relate to climate justice and economic justice and social justice. And there's been groups working at this on a variety of levels. So, for example, we've been supporting groups in Fingal, who last year were campaigning against data centre expansion in Fingal. And then obviously there are groups working on this on a national level as well. And I think few of us could have predicted what an enormous issue data centres have become in Ireland. I'm not going to talk too much about the context because I think our speakers will do a really good job of that. In terms of where Friends of the Earth stands on them, last year we called for a moratorium on data centres. And we're constantly revising this position because, as people probably saw last week, the recent CSO figures show that the amount of energy being used and the amount of electricity being used by data centres has risen, and it's now more than all urban households. So we are revising that position because we want to actually see stronger action on data centres because they're becoming such a threat to climate justice in Ireland. There will be a Q&A as well as part of this talk. So our speakers will talk for about 50 minutes and then there'll be a Q&A. So if you are kind of curious to hear more about a certain issue, do put it in the Q&A and we'll hope to get to it around about 8 o'clock. The final thing also that I just want to say is this is funded through Irish Aid, and we're really grateful to their funding that allows us to run these educational events. And we are running a quick poll, which I'm going to launch now, and we really appreciate it if you, as participants, would be able to give us just a few lines on where you're calling from and things about your understanding of this issue, because it helps us to kind of know who's joining us, where you're joining us from, and also how helpful you find these webinars. You know, do you feel that you've come in with very little knowledge and you've left with a lot of understanding? Really, really helps us to do this and to continue to improve it. So if you have just a minute, I've opened that poll up for people to input where they're calling from, and we really, really like to hear that as well. So without further ado, I am going to hand you over to the first speaker of the night. We have two speakers who work very closely together. They are both called Patrick, and their surnames both begin with B. So for ease of reference, Patrick Bresnihan has been asked to be referred to as Paddy. So Patrick Bresnihan is a lecturer in the Department of Geography at Maynooth University with over 15 years of experience researching and teaching issues related to environmental governance and green political economy in Ireland and abroad. And he'll be joined by Dr. Patrick Brodie, who is a media scholar and assistant professor in the School of Information and Communications at UCD, University College Dublin. And his research very much focuses on the environmental impacts of digital infrastructures like data centres. So we're really, really delighted that they're joining us with their expertise. And they don't just come at this, I think it's fair to say, you don't just come at this from a position of academics, you also have a lot of interest in kind of activism and supporting grassroots struggles around these issues in Ireland and internationally. So that perspective is amazing. So I'm going to hand you over first of all to Patrick Bresnihan, who is going to give you a short intro, and we'll go from there. So thanks all, and we hope you enjoy.
Thanks, Rosie. I just shared the slides. I can't see you anymore, so I just, is that appearing for you? Is that okay?
I can't see them yet.
Yeah. Okay.
But maybe give it one more go and we'll see.
Let's see.
Oh, they're coming up now. That's perfect.
Okay, great. Great, okay. And they're moving as well, are they?
Yeah, they're moving as well.
Okay, that's all good.
Perfect, thank you.
We did a tech check, but you know, things always happen. So thank you so much, Rosie and Emma Jane and Friends of the Earth. I think Pat and I both really appreciate the chance to, you know, have a bit of time. You know, this is like 45 minutes, 50 minutes to talk about our research and kind of dig into some of the, I think, the broader context, political and economic context around data centers in Ireland. I think that there's a real tendency for data centers, like lots of things, to go through this media cycle where they kind of appear. There's a lot of sort of fire and interest for a couple of days, and then it disappears, usually when the CSO publishes its figures or something like that. And that's not that helpful in terms of thinking more strategically and more consistently about what we can do about resisting data centers or challenging their expansion. Because it's been maybe 5 years that we've been studying data centers, and they've been, you know, growing, or they've certainly been a phenomenon on the radar since, you know, 2012, maybe 2013 here. And they're not going away, as we will show in a little bit more detail through the presentation. So 45 minutes, 50 minutes is also a long time to listen, and especially on Zoom, especially on a Monday at 7 o'clock. So what I'm going to do is quite briefly just list or identify the three main things that we're going to try and cover in the talk. So at least if you only listen for the next 5 minutes, you'll have a bit of a gist of what we're talking about. And we'll have other details and stuff, but you know, that's all to kind of flesh this out. So the first thing we're going to talk about, and that's the first part of the talk that I'm going to be covering, is to sort of make the point that maybe we need to step back a little bit from data centers, which might seem a little bit contradictory because that's what we're here to talk about. But The point that data centers, which store and process data, these big sort of sheds that hold all these servers, are really just a physical manifestation, one physical manifestation of a much bigger digital tech economy. And this digital tech economy is based on the growing use and generation of data, including things like AI and all its applications. And despite narratives to the contrary, this isn't because AI and data are universally good or universally sort of useful and beneficial for society, nor is it because we just like cat gifs and we just can't get off our phones because we love watching stupid videos, this kind of thing. The overwhelming driver of growing data use and processing and the data centers that go along with that is the business model of big tech. And it's really important to understand that, because it's important to distinguish that from these kinds of narratives that we often hear that kind of obfuscate that point. So the first part of the talk is going to try to get into that business model, to try to sort of introduce this idea of big tech as a term that we should become more sort of familiar with and use more widely, because it's helpful. So that's the first point. The second point, which Pat is going to cover, is bringing the focus back to Ireland, which we know, most of the people here, I'm sure, is now one of the data center hubs of the world. And the question here is, how do we explain that? Why are there so many data centers here? Why are they so concentrated here? So again, we want to try to take a step back from some of the more simplistic explanations, things like we have a cool climate or an educated workforce, and rather place these recent developments, relatively recent developments of data center expansion within a longer history of Ireland's relationship with foreign direct investment. And in that, what we're trying to point to is that, okay, we have foreign direct investment as a state development policy since the 60s. Again, most people are aware of that. Most people are probably aware that it's very much linked to our tax codes and our tax regime. But it is also very much linked to environmental questions. And so since the 60s, foreign industries have come here because they can access land, they can access resources, they can avail of laxer environmental regulation, and they can also access water and energy infrastructures. And now they can access things like our renewable energy potential and resources. So we think it's important to sort of trace that lineage for two reasons. One is it helps us to see that to challenge data centers means to challenge that model of development. So we have to be quite clear about that and understand that it will be highly contested. And the other point is that there is a long history of resistance to the environmental sort of externalities or problems linked with that model of foreign direct investment led policy. So we can look to that history and we can be inspired by that history of social and environmental movements going back to the 60s and 70s. Okay, so that's the second point. And then finally, and kind of, I guess, stemming from that, is this question about resistance. And this is obviously the hardest part. And Pat and I don't have any solutions to the data center problem. But I think we are trying to, what we try to do in that this third part of the talk is to sort of introduce some orientations. So how can we orientate our thinking around strategies for resisting data center expansion? And one of the things that is helpful, we think, is to think about big tech a little bit like big oil or big pharma or big tobacco. So these are, big, industries with a kind of concentrated corporate power that have been successfully challenged and brought to account for 40, 50 years. And there are elements, I mean, there's certainly differences, but there are elements that are similar to big tech. And we think that there's strategies that we can learn from how big oil, big pharma, big tobacco have been challenged that we can apply to big tech. And very briefly, those three strategies are: one is to challenge dominant industry narratives, so particularly around the promise of green tech. The second is to identify and build alliances with quite diverse campaigns. So these could include things around data justice and data sovereignty, workers' rights, climate justice, more rural-based opposition to expansion of alternative energy infrastructures linked to data centers, a whole range of campaigns. But one of the things that they may share is that they have a common enemy in big tech. And then finally, we talk about the need to emphasize limits on big tech. And this goes to the moratorium point that Rosie was talking about, that anytime limits are brought up, the response from the tech industry and the government is to try to find technological solutions or innovations to sort of skirt the problem. And it's really important that we keep coming back or foregrounding or emphasize the idea that we need to limit big tech and we need to limit the growth of big tech and be very clear about that. Okay, so I feel like you can all now go make your dinner, watch TV. No, actually not. Hopefully we'll say some other things that will be interesting and flesh that out. So here is the basic structure of the talk, the three parts. I'm going to talk about the first part and this question, what drives data usage? Very simple question, complicated answer. Pat, why so many data centers here? And then the last one about how do we challenge the situation? So when we think about data centers, I would say, and how they're commonly presented in the media, it's as these big sheds, fairly nondescript, sort of industrial sheds with loads of servers, like in this picture inside, and they're humming away, and they're somewhere on the M50, which is where most of the data centers in Ireland are located. So you don't see them. There's IKEA, there's big storage units in these data centers. They're kind of invisible in a sense. And the idea is that these servers hold all of our cat videos, holiday pictures, and so on, all of our tweets. And obviously that's partially true, but there is also a lot that we don't see that is going on, and a lot that is not visible to us. And a lot of our work, Pat and I's work, and a lot of the literature we read in critical media studies, geography, science technology studies, is about trying to make these wider processes and structures, relationships and systems and so on more visible. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that here. So to start with, data centers are part of global infrastructural networks, so physical networks. That includes water and energy, which are used to keep them functioning for cooling and for processing the data, but also subsea fiber optic cables that enable flows of data between continents, that connect our devices, our personal devices, to these fiber optic cables, passes this data around, they get stored in data centers, passed elsewhere, and so on. And it's important to think about, this data that is flowing, between data centers and devices and so on, about what the data is, where it's coming from, who is generating it, and why so much of it is being generated. Much of the data that is stored in data centers is from streaming and social media platforms. So things like Netflix, TikTok, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, we're familiar with these. Video content makes up about 60%, between 50 and 60% of data traffic. So that's streaming from Netflix, but also Facebook videos, WhatsApp videos that we send and so on. So they're quite data intensive. But I want to talk a little bit about these streaming and social media platforms and what they're trying to do and how they are kind of organized and designed. So they are organized and designed to attract users to the platform and to keep users on the sites for longer. So they want more and more of our attention, and they want more and more of our interaction. So they want us to like things more, tweet things more, share things more, stream things more. And so there is a lot of what they do is invest in designing their platforms to encourage this. And the reason why this is so crucial to the business model of these social media sites and streaming sites is that by interacting with these sites, we generate data, and we generate data about our preferences, about our likes, and this data then can be monetized. So it becomes a way for these sites to optimize what they're doing, to make it more targeted, but also that data can be sold to third parties for advertising to better target products at us. So fundamentally, their business model is about monetizing data. The more data they can gather, the more revenue they can get. So it is fundamentally about the growth of data generation and use, which also leads to the expansion of data centers. So I'm just going to use Netflix as an example, because I think Netflix, for most of us, we think of Netflix as like an online version of Blockbusters. like an online version of like physical video rental stores that we knew in the 1990s. Well, I knew. Because they have content, which is videos and TV, and you pay a subscription, and then this subscription is used. They buy content or they produce content, which we can then watch. And so that is definitely true. Most of their revenue is from subscriptions. But they also collect a huge amount of data every time we go onto the platform about what we watch, how much we watch it, when we press pause, what things we go back to, and so on. And they use that obviously with their algorithms to tailor content for us. We all know when we go back, sign on in your profile, the stuff that we might like. But they are also now starting to monetize this data by introducing advertising for smaller subscription fees. So if you pay a less fee, you are going to have advertising. And I'm sure that in a few years to come, we will all have to deal with advertising on Netflix. But they can also sell that data to third parties. We don't know what they're doing with it really. Or they could introduce targeted micro advertising within their own shows. So they could produce shows, they could have products in their own shows that are targeted at you. So, in other words, the data that they gather from our interaction on their site is potentially a lot more valuable than the subscriptions they get. So it's just an example that I'm using there to show how central data is to the business model of a lot of these online sites. Okay, so I'm going to move from social media and streaming sites to possibly where we've seen most sort of innovation or most development in this monetization of data online, which is around online retail. So online retail has been around for a lot longer than these streaming sites, and it's on these streaming sites like retail sites like Amazon and Alibaba in China, where there is a lot of this monetization of data happening. So I really like this project from Joanna Mall, who's a media artist from 2019. And in this project, what she does is it's called The Hidden Life of an Amazon User. And what she does is she goes onto Amazon.com and she buys Jeff Bezos's book, The Life Lessons and Rules for Success. And as she moves through the Amazon site, she scrolls, she searches, she clicks, and that takes her through 12 different interfaces. And as she moves through those 12 different interfaces, she generates 8,724 pages of code. You can see that there in the picture. That's what I mean by the code. So actual pages of code that track and personalize her user behavior and experience. That's how much data it is. It's equivalent to 1.07 megabytes. You see there on the side. And this is done involuntarily. She doesn't have a choice. And the energy that's needed to load that information to Amazon's servers, wherever they are, is effectively unloaded onto her personal computer. So as she writes, the user is not just exploited by means of their free labor in terms of producing this data for free, but is also forced to assume the energy costs of such exploitation. So this is happening without our consent, I guess. So through this work, what Joanna Mall is doing is she's highlighting something or making something visible that we don't often think about or see when we buy things online, not just Amazon, but any online retail site. This is what's happening. So she writes, Amazon's business model relies on continuously tracking and recording their customers' behavior and activity in order to amplify the monetization of each user and ultimately to increase Amazon's revenue. So it's not surprising, because they were collecting so much data from so early on, that Amazon Web Services, AWS, was created as a subsidiary of Amazon.com as early as 2006. That's nearly 20 years ago now. Amazon Web Services is the cloud computing division of Amazon.com, and it now accounts for about 33% of all cloud computing, the whole cloud computing market, and more of Amazon's total revenues. So it provides services to other businesses. Amazon Web Services is one of the main providers of cloud computing in Ireland, for example. And last year it generated profits of over 18 billion. And that's because it has developed the expertise early on in how to make use of this data, how to manage it, how to store it and process it, and so on. Okay, I'm just going to take a little pause there for a second. And I'm basically going to try to expand from that argument in a way that Joanna Mall is making. So Joanna Mall is talking about her experience as an individual user, and she's talking also about how the energy cost of that data extraction is outsourced to her and her personal computer. But if we think about the digital tech economy and the cloud economy, we can think about it as a series of externalizations of exploitation of labor, but also the exploitation or appropriation of all sorts of resources at a planetary scale, not just at an individual personal computer. And one of the works that I think maybe kind of captures this really well is this project from 2018 by Kate Crawford, who's a professor in media and a researcher at the Microsoft Research Center in New York. And she did this anatomy of AI with Vlad Joler, who's professor of media. And so anatomy of AI, the name comes from, they take the simplest interaction with AI technology, which is an interaction with an Amazon Alexa. So the interaction is you walk into a room and you say, Alexa, turn on the lights, and the lights turn on. And they take this very mundane interaction and they break it down into all the component parts of labor, resources, energy, infrastructure that is required to make that interaction happen. And this map, which you can't see, it should be blown up much bigger, is basically a map of all of those things, which includes metals and rare earth minerals from Congo to Bolivia. It includes factories in Shenzhen. It includes data servers, including in Ireland. And it includes a lot of labor, of human labor as well. And that's what is required to make this interaction work. And a paper, again, to kind of make this point about the scale of these things that came out, I think, in 2019, University of Massachusetts, it was looking at not just the energy and emissions that are required for say, streaming Netflix or for, making an Amazon Alexa work on an everyday basis, but the amount of energy and associated emissions for training, for this machine learning, for training AI to be able to recognize language like the Amazon Alexa does and to sort of make sense of it is enormous. So this research showed that the amount of energy and emissions to train one of these language algorithms was equivalent to 5 times, or the emissions associated with 5 cars over their lifetime. So if you think about the amount of investment now that's going into things like ChatGPT and all sorts of applications of AI, all of that work to train those machines is a huge amount of energy and emissions. And if you're interested, Kate Crawford went on to write a book called The Atlas of AI, which really kind of goes into more detail on how these global infrastructures and networks that underpin AI technology are, not just damaging the environment, but entrenching inequality and sort of fueling shifts towards undemocratic forms of governance and so on. And the book is really readable. It's kind of more for a popular audience, I would say. I mean, it's very rigorous and so on. But if you want a book, that would be a good one to go to, I think. And the point here that's really important, and I'm going to kind of try to wind up here, is that we hear so much that AI, particularly AI now, is synonymous with progress. And that we can use it to solve problems like, everything from world poverty to climate change. But in fact, if you look at it more closely, more critically, as a lot of these scholars have been doing, we can see that AI, at least in the way in which it's being designed and applied currently, is actually exacerbating a lot of these problems, not going to address them. And this is the kind of final point that I want to end on and sort of push a little bit, is that this brings us to this idea or term of big tech. And big tech is a term that became more popular around 2013-14 as a way to describe the very kind of large role or outsized role that a handful of US-based, largely technology companies were playing in more and more aspects of our lives, everything from transport to work to healthcare. Typically, these companies are Google, Facebook, now Meta, Amazon, Microsoft, sometimes companies like Uber, Twitter. It doesn't really matter the exact composition or who's included in it. The point that big tech tries to the idea big tech tries to grasp is the scale at which these companies are operating. So a scale which is close to and beyond many nation states in terms of the resources and influence that they can wield. And that extends to lobbying and political influence as well. I think the second reason why big tech is helpful, and I've already mentioned it, is that it's a pejorative term. So it's deliberately meant to make us think about big oil, big pharma, big tobacco, and the ways in which we can think about strategies used in the past by climate, health, labor, other social movements to hold this very concentrated power, corporate power, to account. So one of the things that we draw on, particularly in this slide, and this idea of big tech, is from a report from AI Now, which is they're a really great organization. They've been publishing reports on big tech and AI for at least 6 or 7 years now. And one of the things they write about in their latest report, which came out just a couple of months ago, is that they talk about these three elements where big tech are really trying to push or assert their advantage, and where they try to protect their advantage. And these three areas, and I've already outlined some of this, are around data advantage. So this idea that the more data and the more in detail data that a firm has, or firms have, the more competitive advantage they have. So the better position they will be to create AI products that are going to have a gain in the market. So they are very keen to embed themselves more and more in infrastructures, from everything from climate change to transport to healthcare. The second is that kind of expansion of data, and particularly AI and machine learning, is materially is sort of undergirded by material resources. So everything from microchips to energy to power data centers. And these are limits that these companies are coming up against. And particularly in the context of Ireland, that's where we see these contradictions. And the third point is around geopolitical advantage. And I think they're mostly talking from the context of the US, but I think it really applies here in Ireland, because I think what you see here is that it's almost that Ireland's sort of ability to sort of develop, or its sort of future, in fact, is synonymous with the future success and growth of big tech companies. These things have almost become synonymous. It's not just about commerce. It's not just about economy. It's about something more than that. And I think that kind of narrative here is certainly visible, and has even become kind of clear in recent months around fiber optic cables and the kind of questions of security, and even questions of Irish neutrality, which are obviously particularly relevant at the moment. But I'm not going to go into that now. I'm going to finish my part, and I'm going to let Pat pick up on the Irish context.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Patty. So that's given and like fairly comprehensive overview of how some of the intricacies of some of these business models, and sort of how and why we need to be concerned about the type of infrastructural growth and kind of infrastructural output of these industries. Kind of enacts these, and in many ways reproduces particular forms of inequity and particular environmental and degradation, and kind of comes up against particular energy limits, as I'll be talking about here in the case of Ireland. So as Patty was kind of mentioning there, and Rosie introduced, my research has, with Patty, and then as well as from my PhD, looked at the discourses around the data center industry in Ireland, as well as at a kind of more global scale. And what I sort of initially found in these kind of early discourses around data centers coming up around 2012, let's say in Ireland, is that so much of the discourse was around the idea that Ireland had this kind of Goldilocks climate for data centers, right? And while this is in some ways true, and in some ways plays a factor in why are there in answering the question, why are there data centers here? That is only a part of the answer, and quite a small part of the answer, right? Because when it comes down to it, and as other people studying the data center economy have noticed in places like Sweden, Norway, Iceland, the Netherlands, this same argument about climate, about a cool climate, is mobilized in different parts of Northern Europe in order to sort of justify a business model that is centered on this growth of this particular economy, right? And that comes from the industry as well as from the kind of boosters around these industries, right? So the first point I'm going to make around this is that data centers are here in Ireland due to historical and policy factors that we can kind of trace and identify across history, and not necessarily climate, right? As has been discussed, although maybe we could say it's a business climate that has brought them here in a particular way. And then I'm kind of going to go into that while welcome, and these are the kind of 4 points that I hope that by the end of this section here you take away. And so while welcome, efficiency gains, as have been much heralded by the industry and by especially kind of pro data center discourses at the state level, efficiency gains only so far with ongoing growth of these business models, as Patty was discussing there, as well as the infrastructural limits of somewhere like Ireland, right? And we'll go into some of the statistics that sort of demonstrate where data center growth here is coming up against things that it's not coming up against elsewhere, and how that is creating and exacerbating problems, especially around the energy system, and obviously going to create further problems down the road for decarbonization. So the third point is that Irish state policy centered around these industries, as Patty was already sort of discussing, unevenly manages environmental and infrastructural contradictions of this growth. And this is tied back to a model of foreign direct investment-led development. And this isn't just Ireland, right? You know, I'll give some examples from Quebec, for example, that that demonstrate where the precarity of these models lie, and what kind of exposure to a lot of risk you're exposing yourself to by relying so much on that model. And that leads to the fourth point, which is under these conditions, big tech takes on an outsized role in energy and environmental futures. And we need to ask serious and perhaps difficult questions about ways in which to push back against that narrative, because as Patty was saying there, big tech is not necessarily coming in as a kind of benevolent force for these things. They have a particular profit motive and a particular investment in making themselves more involved in different kind of infrastructural and utility systems. So Patty, you can go to the next slide. So it's really been discussed to death at this point across different kind of media cycles, but I'll kind of reproduce a few of these arguments here just so that we get on the same page. So Ireland is one of the most concentrated data center markets in the world, and I want to emphasize the choice of words in concentrated as opposed to largest. Because while it's certainly large in terms of the share of data hosting and the revenue generated here through these business models that Patty was talking about, what's important for how we analyze data centers here is the scale in relation to the available infrastructure, right? And kind of and the problems that's presenting. Because Ireland makes up about 25% of Europe's data center market. And if you just look at, again, the size of Ireland in relation to the rest of Europe in terms of population, in terms of area, that's an absolutely massive proportion. So we have a situation where a ton of European data operations, whether cloud storage or streaming or what have you, are essentially being outsourced to Ireland, right? This is where these operations are happening, right? So when you're on, when you're streaming a video from Netflix, that instead of, having a piece of physical media in front of you, instead of that coming from a hard drive, where that's coming from is a AWS data center somewhere down the road in, Tala or wherever else, right? One of the availability zones, because Netflix rents out server space from AWS, right? And so this computing power, this server capability, which has been developed here over the past decade or so, is key, because as data compliancy and use regulations get more institutionalized, as they absolutely need to be through things like GDPR and kind of data rights and protection, as they're being further sort of institutionalized, Ireland is becoming a de facto hub for European data governance, right? And this is in spite of the fact that prior to these last few years, this might not have been as much of a strategic priority, right, at the kind of policy level, right? So you have this necessary growth of data compliance operations here, both in terms of industry and in terms of policy. And this is huge, right? Because you have things like a few years ago, for example, Microsoft was requisitioned by, I think it was the FBI in the US because there was data that they needed to access in Ireland, right? That raised data sovereignty debates, right? What is the actual legality of accessing data across the ocean, right? We have a situation where there's countries in Europe, as kind of across a lot of the Western world that are talking about banning TikTok, for example, right? And Ireland hosts or will host very soon 2 TikTok data centers, right? Which are rented out from a company. But when it comes down to it, will Ireland then have a conflict of interest if there is a European push to ban something like TikTok, right? Because of the infrastructure that's hosted here, because of the jobs that are, ostensibly in their data compliance office that they also have here in Dublin, right? So when it comes down to it, these types of contradictions only start to be exacerbated with the ongoing growth of this industry. Because in May 2022 industry report, Arizon identifies Ireland as the fastest growing hyperscale data center market over the next 6 years. So this growth is continuing, an annual growth forecast of 5.76% between 2022 and 2027. And this is in spite of ostensible curbs on development, as we'll sort of be discussing in terms of how successful or how kind of practicable they actually are at the minute. So yeah, Patty, you can skip to the next slide now. So all of these expansions require infrastructure that goes beyond just the servers, that goes beyond the data centers themselves. It also requires energy, water, and all of the other kinds of material infrastructural inputs that make a building full of servers run, right? Because a building full of servers gets hot, it needs to be cooled down, and to cool it down, you need a lot of energy and you need a lot of water, right? There's this really amazing chapter in this book called Digital Energetics that came out just a couple of months ago, actually, from University of Minnesota Press. And Ann Pasik's chapter in it talks about how computing itself is, this idea of computing requiring energy is not new. In fact, the transportation of signals within computing systems has always been electrical, right? And there's all these, sort of like physics equations and everything that I don't fully understand, and I'm not going to get into the technicalities of it, but she outlines how efficiency can only go so far under the current regime of computing, unless there are massive gains in computing efficiency that are not currently possible within the current materials available, that efficiency can only go so far, right? So when it comes down to it, once you reach a particular point of efficiency, right, for example, your phone can only hold so much information, that means that it needs to be, that this efficiency, that the circulation of data, that needs to be outsourced somewhere. The more and more data that is generated, that is stored, that is circulated, needs to be going and needs to be stored somewhere, right? And that will require, as long as this industry keeps growing, that will require more and more data center infrastructure. So Patty, you can skip, yeah. So globally, various estimates say that data centers use between 1% and 3% of global electricity, and similar estimates around the greenhouse gas emissions, again, somewhere around the kind of 1% to 3% range. But it's not even just energy, it's also water. They require quite a bit of water, as we'll discuss in a minute here. And we can point to major studies done in engineering, as I was kind of mentioning there, around energy efficiency, right? We can look at this International Energy Agency report where the data center workloads from 2015 to 2021 went up by 260%, and the data center energy use only went up between 10 and 60%, right? So we do see that while computing necessity, computing workload has gone way, way up, energy has grown, so energy requirements have grown slightly more modestly. But I want to hone in for a second on that discrepancy in numbers there, because the discrepancy is between 10 and 60%. That is quite a huge margin of error, while still lower than 260%. One of the major issues in studying this industry and kind of holding it to account is that a lot of these numbers are generated and put forth by the industry, right? Because it's proprietary information. So I always give an example. When I was in Quebec doing research on a particular data center project there, I was speaking to Hydro-Quebec, which is the state utility for energy. And what the person told me when I sort of asked about the specifics of the energy uses of this one facility wasn't that, oh, I don't know. It wasn't that, oh, we still need to do studies. It was, we know, but we can't tell you, because making that information public potentially betrays trade secrets about energy efficiency within this particular data center, right? So whatever the truth of that as the reason why it wasn't shared, that is an interesting dynamic, that these numbers are held by the industry and they're difficult to access as someone from outside of these industries, right? From outside of these companies. Patty, you can skip to the next slide. So just looking more specifically here at Ireland, the specific energy consumption statistics, electricity consumption by data centers increased by 31% between 2021 and 2022. Again, when there have been sort of ostensible curbs in place, there's probably a backlog of data centers that were still being built, but even still, this growth is quite significant. The increase from 2015 to 2022 was much more massive. The percentage of total metered electricity consumption accounted for by data centers increased from 5% in 2015 to 18% in 2022. So that's, again, quite a huge jump. And on the other side of this, you have consumption by urban residential and rural residential users, both of which are now lower in total electricity consumption than data centers. This decreased by 10 and 9% respectively between 2021 and 2022, right? So these numbers actually went down, right? Household energy efficiency, in spite of difficulties and in spite of the fact that this has been slow to roll out, is actually getting better, right? So we have a situation where sort of residents, people who live here are reducing their energy consumption while you have this massive energy consumption from data centers. AirGrid estimates that even with curbs on growth at the minute, data centers will account for 30% of electricity on the grid by 2030. And BitPower notes that 14 more data centers are under construction, 40 more have planning permission, and those 40 alone will demand more electricity than the 82 operating now. So Patty, you can skip to the next slide just to show, this is the BitPower page. You can visit this page. It's an industry website that does a kind of self-reporting around these things. Again, the numbers can sometimes be sort of difficult to follow because they can be different across different websites and things. This is one that the industry itself is reporting. And I think that most significant for me here is that we have 82 operational data centers in Ireland using 1,261 megawatts of electricity. The 40 planning approved data centers are projected to use 1,286 megawatts of electricity. So this growth, with the ongoing growth, we also see the scale of particular projects getting even bigger, right? So this is, that is, in each individual data center project here is much larger in scale than the average size of any of the existing operational data centers here, right? So you can skip to the next slide here. Okay, and so just because I think a comparative approach is instructive and useful, again, just to get a sense of the scale of, why this is, this is an issue particularly here in Ireland, we can go back to the same International Energy Agency report about data centers and look at a country of similar size, Denmark, which is also a hyperscale data center market for hosting companies such as Apple. Ireland's energy use from data centers was 14% in 2021, as we know, and as cited in this report, and it was up to 18% in 2022. Denmark, which is, again, a country of a similar size with a hyperscale data center industry, is projected to reach 7% by 2025, right? So this will still be less than half of what data centers in Ireland currently consume proportionally to the electrical grid in total. And by that point, by 2025, Ireland's data centers will be well beyond 20%. And if we, this isn't in this particular report, but the Netherlands, which is another similarly sized country, and which also has quite a large data center market, states that the estimates are that data centers use between 2 and 3% of the Netherlands' electricity on a daily basis. And this is a country that is facing huge objections to the ongoing growth of data centers, as Patty will talk about, and has also imposed a moratorium in its major data center market in Amsterdam, right? And this is at 2 to 3% of the country's metered electricity consumption, right? So again, just to emphasize, the scale of the problem here in Ireland is extremely significant. And then finally, just to get to the water part, which is a little bit less our purview and isn't talked about as much, to be honest, but just to look at the Facebook data center complexes water usage here in Ireland, which comes from their own sustainability report from 2021, which they're using almost double the water here in Ireland that they are in their next most water intensive facility, which is in the US. So between 558,000 cubic meters of water in the US versus 928,000 here in Ireland, right? So again, the scale of what these companies are using here in terms of infrastructures and utilities is extremely significant, right? And this growth then comes up against these practical limits of what's available here, right? And the industry is then able to lobby for techno solutions to the problems that they are exacerbating. So Patty, you can skip to the next slide. Now, I'm not going to go too much into detail about this. I'm sure many people are familiar with the history of Ireland's attraction of foreign direct investment. So this hasn't happened overnight, right? This kind of incentivization and accommodation of these multinational industries like big tech here in Ireland, right? Because it wasn't just computing and tech industries, right? You know, Intel is a good example, but it was also pharmaceuticals, it was chemicals manufacturing, right? Which were very polluting industries. And sociologist Dennis O'Hearn writes really well about this in the late 90s and early 2000s, about how multinational companies in these industries recognize that Ireland's available land, industrial incentives, and tax environment, as well as a kind of lax environmental regulatory regime, was less stringent than neighboring and similar markets. So where little investment or few jobs had previously existed, there were now large-scale manufacturing facilities that sure polluted the ground and water and emitted tons of carbon, but at least there was regional development, right? And the EPA was actually developed in response to these pollution pressures, including pushback from local communities, as Patty's going to talk about in the final section of the talk. But ultimately, the state has to step in through mechanisms like this and manage and incentivize these technical responses to what are ultimately environmental and infrastructural problems. And this is just to emphasize that we're seeing similar technical discourses emerge today in response to questions raised around data centers, which deflect opposition into proposed technical solutions like district heating systems, kind of renewable energy contracts. Although the key factor is that now these are entirely industry-led and without the same level of jobs increases, right? Direct jobs increases. So Patty, you can skip to the next slide. One of these examples is through corporate power purchase agreements. So this is kind of a two birds, one stone thing from a state perspective, where companies can purchase renewable energy directly from an energy provider, right? So for example, from a wind farm. And the idea is that this is a demand-led strategy, right? So a company basically makes it viable for this energy provider for this energy generator to exist for 15 years or whatever the length of these contracts are. But what these are is effectively an offset, right? Amazon isn't directly getting this energy, and in fact, they're not adding additionality to the grid, because this is, while it is new renewable energy capacity, it's a fraction of what these data centers are ultimately using, right? So they would need to buy extremely significant amounts of these corporate power purchase agreements to actually argue that they're adding additionality to the grid, right? Because otherwise they're just kind of offsetting their energy use. You can skip to the next slide, Patty. And with this in mind, then an industry solution that's being proposed is that data centers can connect directly to wind and solar farms, for example, right? So it would be more efficient this way to just directly plug in to a wind farm, right? And then you don't get the arguments about the fact that this isn't directly going to the data centers, right? But then the problem is that you potentially are getting energy siloing, right? This new energy is just going directly to the data center. And then what happens to the additional energy, right? Does that belong to the data center? Who administers that additional energy, right? And that's an issue that hasn't come up, but is something that we need to keep an eye on. And then Patty, you can skip through these next few slides. Sorry, this is where our text for our notes get a little bit more chaotic. But on top of this, sorry, you can go back to the last. Actually, this is all sort of part of the same argument, which is that companies are starting to argue that data centers will actually be essential to decarbonizing the grid by doing things like enhancing grid flexibility to intermittent renewable energy sources, providing battery storage, right? Microsoft has this very significant kind of experimental project here where they've been using their data center batteries, which are essential because they need constant power. So if the grid goes out, they can use these batteries until their generators fire on. Again, we can discuss a little bit more of these technicalities later on, but basically what they realized is that they can provide these grid solutions as a battery storage facility, and then that energy can go back to the grid at times that they need sort of additional supply. Now, we don't know what that actually looks like in terms of who owns that energy, how that energy is administered, right? This is something that is still in development and something that, again, to keep an eye on, because it's something that Microsoft is planning on exporting. They're planning on performing this model elsewhere as well, and Ireland is kind of the test case for it. And then finally, the one that frequently gets brought up is Amazon Web Services involvement in the Tala district heating scheme, where they're going to be providing waste heat from their servers for a district heating mechanism, which is, again, on the surface, these are all positive developments towards corporate sustainability, right? Especially as they appear to be giving back to the public in these instances. However, it remains to be seen whether these are ultimately publicly beneficial in the long term, or whether they are also commercialization opportunities, right? Whether these are technologies that they are then going to monetize and apply elsewhere, right? In the end, what are we locking in by making these companies essential to a new renewable grid? Most of us, I think, would rightfully be skeptical of locking in, for example, natural gas heating as a transition fuel due to the cost of replacement once society fully decarbonizes, right? So what happens if we lock in heating and electricity via these private multinational digital infrastructures when the life cycles of these buildings is quite short, and these companies are ultimately beholden to profit more so than the public delivery of utilities and services, right? Their business model is what Patty was describing before. How is that then being kind of downstreamed within these different energy politics that we're seeing? So I just want to kind of bring up one more example from my Quebec case. I don't have a slide for this, but I was researching an Ericsson data center in Quebec. It was a huge facility, going to be a massive investment in the suburbs of Montreal, in a small town called Vaudreuil-Dorion. And this suburb really bent over backwards to accommodate this facility, including giving a tax holiday. The Quebec energy utility, Hydro-Quebec, set up a brand new power line extension. They built new infrastructure to plug them into the grid. I spoke with an employee of Hydro who told me that this company especially, and that companies in general, are shopping around different locations, right? They want to get the best package for what they see as an infrastructural investment, right? So Hydro-Quebec had even set up a special data center unit to attract this investment. They had to basically bid to get this company here. Less than 1 year after building this data center, Ericsson shuttered the data center and moved out with a kind of shrug. The market's changed. They didn't need this data center anymore. What would have happened had Ericsson actually been institutionalized as a grid service provider, a provider of district heating, right? So I think that this lock-in around these companies is something we need to consider much more seriously, and perhaps with much more difficult questions about how important these companies are to the development of our kind of energy and other infrastructural futures. And I'll just kind of end on this last slide here. Patty, you can go to the Brodie slide. Yeah. So here we see, this is a Brodie project called the Brodie Energy Park, which you can see sort of imagines this closed loop system, basically, around wind energy, solar energy, and data centers, right? Private industry. And Brodie is looking for private multinational data center investment in these types of things, right? So again, this is kind of a much more intensified version of the things that we're already seeing sort of played with here in Ireland, right? What happens if these become these kind of siloed energy data infrastructural facilities, right? And again, that's just something that I would say that with the still growing power of big tech, this is something that we need to be sort of seriously focusing on if we are going to be looking at the politics of digital data infrastructures within decarbonization. So that I will stop there to let Patty get to a few minutes of discussing alternatives before we sort of bum everybody out too much.
Thanks, Pat. Yeah, and we're getting on to 50 minutes already, so it's a long time of listening. So I think this will be shorter. I'm hoping maybe like 8 minutes or something like that, even though it's the most important part of the talk. But we can get into it more in the discussion. So I think I said at the beginning, yeah, what we're going to sort of offer are kind of three sort of things to think about in terms of orientating resistance to the growth of big tech and specifically data center expansion here. And I think what we've just traced out can be quite overwhelming and intimidating. It's like the whole of big tech, this massive big economy, and it's all about data extraction and so on. And then also Ireland's like FDI model going back to the 60s, and somehow it can be like, oh, there's nothing we can do. But there are things we can do, and I think that there are very concrete things we can do, and they're already being done. Friends of the Earth are doing them, Schliel are doing them, Future Proof Clare are doing them. There's lots of small groups and individuals and NGOs who are clearly working on this stuff, so none of it's going to be that new. One thing I would emphasize again is this point about big tech being somewhat aligned with or similar to big oil, big pharma, big tobacco. And that applies to Ireland as well. So I don't think, and it's a lot with our kind of social movement history and activist kind of histories, they're not as well known, they're not as well recorded for different reasons. But the no toxics movement, particularly in the 1980s, was a movement which was linked with the anti-nuclear movement, which people are more familiar with in Carnsore Point, for example. But this no toxics movement was about confronting the expansion of pharmaceutical and chemical industries in parts of Ireland at a time where these were being very much attracted to Ireland. There was no EPA, there was very little regulation over them. And these often community-based groups, but also linked with other kinds of social movements and activist groups, were quite effective in stopping specific developments. So well-known one was Ray Bestos's Manhattan. They had a big project in Cork in 1980, 1979, and they pulled out. So there's a record of them stopping these specific developments, but also pushing the state to act. And Pat has already mentioned this, but the EPA, which was set up in 1993, was not something that was sort of brought to Ireland from the EU, which is the common narrative that the only reason we have environmental kind of policy or governance is because of the foresight of the EU and so on. It was no, actually, if you look at what was happening at that time and some of the work that's written about it too, it was very much pushed by these movements and by public pressure around concerns around pollution linked with these kinds of industries. So that, I think it can be useful for us thinking about today. So 3 things I'm going to talk about: challenging big tech narratives, building alliances, and demanding limits. Where have I gone? Okay, so we're familiar with how big industry, whether it's tobacco, this is an ad from the 1950s, or whether it's more recently, fossil fuel companies, big oil, have managed to, use narratives, bend facts, manipulate realities to sort of greenwash or whitewash or, whatever it is you want to wash, health wash their products. And there is work that has to be done and has been done, say around tobacco or say around oil, by activists and movements and scientists to show that these attempts by these companies to make what their activities, what they're doing, more benign, more sustainable, better for our health, to show that they are false, to call them out as false. That may seem an obvious point, but with big tech, particularly around green solutions that we see in this country, and Pat has alluded to, we don't see as much pushing back on that. There is, and this is because the industry has been very successful in sort of pivoting since the 2014-15, when it started coming under scrutiny for its carbon footprint, its environmental footprint. It's been very quick, and it has the resources to do that, to sort of position itself not just as being sustainable, but as actually necessary to decarbonization and moving towards renewable energy. And partly because their supply chains, these green supply chains, so-called, are so complex and they are unaccountable and they are opaque, it is hard always to sort of question them and to challenge them and show that they are not necessarily doing what they say they're doing. But we need to do that. And we need to be quicker. I think in Ireland, for example, commentators, environment NGOs, for reasons that are understandable, are much quicker, for example, to call out claims by the agri-food industry when they green certain things that they do. Much quicker, and it's kind of more natural to be skeptical and to question that. And we need to sort of develop and promote that much more when it comes to tech, because they are very good at presenting this idea of the cloud. What they do is kind of shiny and sleek, post-industrial, all this stuff, and it's not the case, as we've tried to show. It's very, very much material. Okay, so that's the first point. Second, about building alliances, I think this goes back to our point about data centers not being the only issue. If we understand data centers as being one manifestation of a much bigger big tech problem, we can start to see that we might have things in common with other campaigns. So, if you open the paper on an average day here, you will find a lot of different places where big tech are coming up against issues, whether it's to do with privacy, surveillance, mental health, exploitation of workers, a whole set of things. And those issues are connected to data centers, even though it may not seem obvious, but they're connected to data centers because it's about big tech, this handful of companies who have a huge amount of power, pursuing their business model and trying to maximize profits and maximize returns for shareholders and so on. And that gives rise to these contradictions. And so there is a space, even though it is this vast sort of thing and infiltrates so many aspects of our life, the flip side of that is that we can find common cause. We can find common cause with other groups, which may not seem on first sight to have much in common. And I think this is starting to happen. This is a quote from Sebastian Laude, who's involved in some stuff that Pat is also involved in, called Data Territories, which is really worth checking out. So specifically, it's around international opposition to data centers, everywhere from Chile to Netherlands to Ireland to South Africa. But it's also about understanding that this issue of data center expansion is connected to things like, workers unionizing in Amazon or digital rights. And so the more that analysis and the more that organizing can draw out these kinds of commonalities, or the fact that there is a common enemy, I think that there is power in that. And again, that goes back to things like big oil, big tobacco. There was different kinds of groups that have different types of concerns, but ultimately they had to find each other to become more powerful. And in Ireland, I think that we see that in a specific formation. I think we've seen sort of climate justice groups like Shiala, Not Here, Not Anywhere, Friends of the Earth, sort of more so, linking up or connected to concerns, particularly in rural areas, around the expansion of energy infrastructures, maybe battery arrays, maybe wind farms, solar farms, that are linked with data centers. So even though there might seem to be something that's confusing there, because on the one hand, one might be about emissions, one might be about renewable energy, in fact, those things can be linked, and they are being linked. And I would just flag that the climate camp that's coming up in August, which I'm sure some of you are hoping to attend, others should attend, I think it's going to be really interesting and exciting this year in Leitrim, because a lot of these things are kind of coming together. And it is those kinds of forums and those kinds of points of meeting is where these kinds of links are made. And we really need to be, present to sort of articulate those kind of links, I think, all of us. Okay, and then finally, this point about limits. And I know that it's going to come up maybe in the discussion about how, but isn't there this solution, or isn't this thing something that we could apply? And, as Pat said, there's nothing wrong with efficiencies. There's nothing wrong with things being made to use less energy. But the problem is that this is what the tech industry, and this is also what the government have been very successful, and successive governments have been very successful at doing. And ultimately what it is, it's a delaying tactic, and it's a way of obfuscating the root problem. And I'm just putting up this Twitter feed because it's from Barry McMullen, who some of you maybe know, professor of engineering, DCU, great authority on these issues. And he spoke to the Oireachtas Committee back in September 2021 about data centers. And he made it very clear, in light of the science, that what was needed was to stop the increase of data centers because they consumed more energy at a time when we needed to be reducing energy use to make it more likely we'd meet our targets. And he said we should have a moratorium. A very moderate demand to have a moratorium, at least until we have the information that will allow us to make some better policies. Because at the moment, there's not even a census of how many data centers there are in the country. As Pat alluded to, so much of the information about energy and so on is proprietary. So we need that information before we can take some kind of reasoned, policy steps. So it's a very reasonable position, but nothing happened. There was a slight moratorium over the Greater Dublin area that was quickly skirted around because data centers were able to build their own on-site, gas turbines and link up with gas networks, which meant they didn't have to link with EirGrid. So they'll always find ways around it. And I think that what you see then, since these kinds of demands around a moratorium, which also got quite a lot of support from opposition parties, I think most people on the street would probably be like, that's fair enough. A very strong pushback from government, but also from state agencies, from quite public commentators, media, making this point that we don't have too many data centers, we don't have enough energy. We also can make data centers work for the decarbonization of the grid and so on. And this has been Pat and I have really seen this so much that from initial recognition there was a problem to how in the space of maybe 2 years, it's been very much this idea that now data centers are essential to climate action and decarbonization. And you're just scratching your head. It's like, how did this happen? And it's because the door is opened up there to technical solutions and green tech solutions and so on. And it's why it's so important to emphasize this point of limits and moratorium, because it's a very simple demand that there should be a moratorium. It's very moderate, it's very reasonable. And I think it's the sort of demand you could get a lot of support around because it is so reasonable. So I'm going to just, I'll leave it there. We've talked for ages, and I hope you're still listening, and we can have a discussion now. So
thank you so much. Thank you, Patrick and Patrick, for that really valuable discussion. We have, just to let other people know as well, because I know what webinar you can't see how many people are joining. There's 90 of us have been listening, so that's really good. So just to make people feel connected, and from all over Ireland as well, which is brilliant. I'm going to we have loads of questions in the Q&A, and thank you so much to everyone who's engaging with that and participating. It's really nice to see that participation. I'm going to try and combine a few of these questions because we have about 15 minutes left. So I know people have asked some specific questions, and we will be sending resources out after this. So if there's something you missed, hopefully you can catch it back. I want to start by asking you, I'll ask you 2 questions at the same time, and maybe if you could keep the responses kind of as short as you can so we get through. There's a question, if there was a moratorium on data centres in Ireland, would they not go elsewhere, and would that not be equally bad? And also a question that has been raised a few times, and I think it's in response to the Irish Times article today. If the challenges caused by data centres, do they not distract us from other issues? around decarbonising areas of around housing and transport. So I don't know if Patrick, you want to just speak a little bit to that quickly before we ask other questions.
Yeah, I can jump in on the first question a little bit and keep it fairly brief because it's a really good question and it's one that always comes up, I think, in terms of campaigns that are seen to be like objecting to an industry or to an infrastructural project, right? You know, the idea is that you know, if you say I just don't want it here, that means it's going to go somewhere else, right? And I think that's actually a really useful thing to think about in terms of making connections with other places where this might go, right? So for example, Patty mentioned there the contested data territories initiative that Sebastian Lewede and Julia Rohn and Hunter Vaughan kind of got going at Cambridge back in the fall, but they hosted a series of public talks which talked about the very different sites at which this activism around data centers was happening. And what was so valuable and so kind of inspiring about those events is the ways in which each of these places was also completely thinking about and in solidarity with these other places and trying to make links and connections, right? And I think that's what you can do, right? Is sort of saying that, yes, there needs to be action. Yes, you need to think about the global context, but when it comes down to it, you do have to look at what's happening locally in order to affect change and in order to have an impact on the ways these things are being developed. But that then, you know, can be strengthened by a multifaceted and, you know, approach to these things, right? And thinking about the fact that, yes, a data center that doesn't land in Quebec might end up in Ireland and vice versa, or it might end up in Chile, right? Or probably not Chile because of the regional aspects of these things, but you know what I mean, right? And that is worth thinking about, but that should kind of make us double down on thinking internationally about the ways in which these things happen and thinking about the ways in which it's not just a national policy. We need to have a kind of transnational and international, you know, solidarity, you could say, but also strategy in terms of, you know, supporting and thinking about these other groups. Yeah.
Thanks so much. And also, I suppose, comes back to a little bit what you said, Patty, about limits.
Yeah.
And the ecological limits.
I also think that you could think about big oil and climate justice, like not here, not anywhere is in the name. You know, that fracking was banned in Ireland, but that means that you have to campaign to not import fracked gas from elsewhere and so on. Also many, you know, Standing Rock. There's many examples where there have been objections to specific infrastructures that have, you know, meant that it can be a way to sort of channel international sort of movements and so on. I'll just speak to the second one though about the decarbonization, which I haven't read that article, but it's a common one. And Pat and I have talked about this, and I think one of the things that we tried to get across in this talk and in our work is that it's not just about emissions. I think one of the things that we're trying to point to is that in their effort to decarbonize, the tech sector, particularly big tech, these companies, are becoming more and more involved in the delivery of alternative energy and these new grids that we need. And that poses different kinds of questions, which very specific examples, Amazon were involved in a corporate power purchase agreement with a wind farm in Donegal. There was a peat slide. This was one of the sites that we've gone to research and talk to people there. That wind farm is being developed for a data center. It caused a massive peat slide. That's not to do with climate change, but it is an environmental justice issue. Similarly, in the Midlands, where the energy park is being built, it's supposed to be a just transition. Those kinds of infrastructures that are being built but are not for workers, they're not for communities. So I think we need to look at the ways in which data centers are kind of sort of decarbonizing in ways that do not advance social and environmental justice. And if that is our lens, social and environmental justice, then we're not just interested in emissions, which are obviously important, but it's not the only thing. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Patrick. That's really interesting. I want to also come to a question that Megan has asked, because I think it's a really good one and a really important one in terms of strategy. What has worked in other countries? Do you think it would be better to unite behind a specific goal, or to kind of you've used the word extreme views, Megan, so that moratorium stands out as a moderate goal. So basically make a moratorium seem like the moderate goal. And what is the union's position? I know you may not be able to speak on the union's position, but you have mentioned it there around just transition and the promise of jobs that may not actually be come to fruition. Do you want to just speak very briefly on that strategic question?
Do you want to go, Pat?
Yeah, I mean, I can answer the. I don't know the position of unions specifically around data centers, but I could say that some of the alignments or some of the kind of strategies of other places around data centers have been fairly similar to what we've seen here, right? In terms of Not Here, Not Anywhere, Shliela, Friends of the Earth, right? Is a sort of exactly what you're saying, right? It's a trying to surface the problems of these economies within these very particular localized circumstances, right? And a lot of times you get very, in terms of success, I don't know if there has been a whole lot of success at a global level in terms of stopping these things yet, right? And that's something that we need to, obviously means that the efforts need to be sort of focused on and doubled and, everything, right? But there's a lot of, kind of small affordances given by these tech companies, right? Like, for example, I can think of in Paris, an Equinix data center was being developed and the community was objecting over noise pollution, right? Which enabled them to kind of get into the public discourse and sort of make people aware of the fact that companies were developing data centers in, the suburbs of Paris, right? Which was something that hadn't really been focused on yet, right? Which is in itself a valuable action, right? So it's things like finding these strategic points that make sense within, whether it's a heavily urbanized Parisian suburb or whether it's, a particular place in, where the energy grid is being overwhelmed, right? It's about finding what problems those data centers are raising in a particular place, focusing on that, and then at least trying to raise the issue is pretty much what I've seen work at this point in terms of at least getting the public discourse moving. Yeah.
Well, I'll just say something really briefly just about that question about it's kind of a reformist demand. I mean, I think that that's the potential of something like a moratorium, is that it has the capacity to bring together quite a lot of different groups, like climate scientists, more radical anti-capitalist groups, rural campaigners against energy infrastructures. I think a lot of different, a lot of different campaigns and groups, and what's the word I'm looking for? Not demographics, but could be brought together under that demand, which is a very moderate demand, but within the context that we've outlined. And I think that earlier question about, oh, everything's going to collapse, because that's what we're told, if there's a moratorium, it's the end of Ireland, no more data centers. So on the one hand, it is moderate enough to have a broad church, but on the other hand, it is a very radical thing to push on. So I think strategically it could be useful, but that's just my take.
Thanks, Million. Yeah, and we've certainly seen lots of different tactics in Ireland through either protest at the sites of companies, local groups building solidarity in their own communities, like happened in Fingal, and spreading awareness there. So it's really interesting tactics to be explored, and I think that's a conversation we could have all day and should have all day at some point soon. I want to go back to two questions that I think you've spoken a lot about, but I think are really important and maybe worth reiterating. Why can't we just power all these data centers with renewables? And are we individually complicit in the fact that we use platforms like Netflix and Twitter and all these things? And I know you spoke a lot about this at the beginning of the talk, but if you just wanted to kind of recap or sum up some of those issues.
Patty, you can go on this one.
Okay, I'll go with the second one about the individual complicity, because I think that is very important. And again, I feel like a lot of our talk was designed around trying to sort of challenge narratives that we hear a lot, particularly in the media in Ireland. And one of those is that individuals need to change their behavior around data. And it's very similar to what we've seen around carbon emissions. And I had that slide up from BP. And, you know, at this stage, I think a lot of people know that that whole idea of a carbon footprint was actually developed by BP as a way to deflect attention from the fact that they were continually, you know, to expand the production of oil and the circulation of oil and the selling of oil. So it's very similar with what's happening with tech and with data, which is that rather than put attention on this business model, which I outlined, I hope, clearly enough, which literally we're talking about hiring psychologists, designers, you know, a whole teams of people whose expertise is in making you engage more with their platform. So here's you tired, you know, struggling to pay your bills on the train, doing whatever. And, you know, you're on these platforms because everyone's on these platforms, and you're faced with this interface, which is deliberately designed to keep you there, to, you know, the doom scrolling stuff. And we're like, oh, aren't we terrible? It's designed to be like that, you know. It's the same way as a lot of people now we know about fast fashion, designed to be thrown away. And I think this idea of thinking about like fast data would be a good one. Like it's designed to be cheap. And that's because the companies that profit from it can externalize those costs, just like fashion industry can externalize the cost, just like oil can externalize the cost. So we have to be very clear that it's those business models, and it's the production and profiting from data. It's not from our consumption. So that's what I would say to that. And I'll leave Pat talk about the renewable.
Well, I mean, just to jump on the back of that, there's a really great book by Laurie Parsons called Carbon Colonialism that I think gets at that in a really nice way, because he's talking specifically about fast fashion as well, right? And, you know, he says, I get the question all the time, like, what can I do about fast fashion? And he says, go to your government, protest, right? You know, he's like, these are the things, he's like, because ultimately the supply chain is almost unimaginably huge, right? You know, and you have things like Patagonia coming out and, you know, it turning out that they're using the same places, but not to get into fast fashion debate. But in terms of the renewable energy, you know, why can't they just sort of be plugged in and we just let them go? Ultimately, it's about what, again, it's about what Patty was talking about in terms of, you know, the kind of locking in and the further incentivization of this business model through something like, you know, like Bord Nimona is a semi-state company, right? Why is Bord Nimona as a semi-state company developing what are ultimately sort of data energy silos that require very few workers on land that was formerly, you know, employing quite a few people and, you know, ostensibly in the public interest, right, in a particular way? What is the sort of future that you are locking in through doing that? And that would kind of be my point around this, is that at the surface, right, you know, you can look at the ways in which, you know, if a data center is completely powered by wind energy and just doing its thing, then it appears as though, you know, that's kind of, you know, that's the ideal, right? It's still working. But when you look at the kind of wider supply chains around that, right, you know, in terms of the other types of, you know, let's say mineral supply chains and things that these are all plugged into, as well as the business models that that's enabling and what that represents in terms of what the future looks like, is that that forecloses much different ways of thinking about what, you know, a kind of energy data future might look like, right? And I think that that's kind of our point, is that locking these things in and sort of just these things marching ahead ultimately presents futures that we really, really probably don't want to deal with and are going to present more and more and different challenges going ahead. So now is a good time to intervene while we're kind of looking at them as they're being developed, right? If that makes sense. And Patty, I think you can jump in there.
I'm just going to say one more thing, because I think there's lots of things to say about this, about the energy. But one is, it's just a basic question of justice, climate justice, environmental justice, social justice. So Amazon has a claim that by 2025, it'll be 100% renewable in all its operations. So its distribution facilities, its data centers. If that is the case, which could be, there is no way that all of the other things that we need to make renewable are going to be renewable. Our transport systems, our heating, our houses. And what you are already seeing, and in those CSO figures, I think it's what makes so many people angry, is that people are in energy poverty. So it's not even a question of renewable electricity. It's about there not being enough energy. And at the same time, you have these incredibly powerful, profitable corporations that are claiming that they're, taking climate action and they're 100% renewable, where houses are still on solid fuels. They're terrible insulation, they're not being retrofitted. It's just a very, very clear, basic question of justice. And I think, for everybody, not just people who are maybe more on the left or anti-capitalist or whatever, but like the more that continues, the more there will be anger, and the more there will be pushback, and there will be resentment, and there will be all of these sorts of feelings, which may not be channeled into more progressive directions. And I think that that's something that we also have to be very aware of. That if people are angry and resentful, they're right to be, but they can be channeled into more reactionary right-wing kinds of politics, and we already see that happening. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. And I think that's a really strong way to close. And we'd certainly agree that this is an issue of justice. And as you've rightly said, we should be probably prioritising any renewables into decarbonising housing and transport rather than private businesses, which is definitely something we would be interested in looking in more around the earth. Thank you so much to everyone who has tuned in, and thank you so much, Patrick Brodie and Patrick Bresnihan, for sharing just such a fascinating talk. We covered so much there. And we will be sharing the resources that you spoke about tomorrow to everyone who attended, and also some of the book recommendations you gave, because I think that would be fascinating. Just to let you know, before you leave, we are hosting kind of a follow-up workshop on this issue next Monday. And I've just posted the link in the chat where we're going to kind of explore these issues and try and design a postcard to our decision makers that expresses why we are worried about data centers and what we want them to do about it. So I put that in the chat, and everyone will receive a link to that as well tomorrow. I'm also just going to open a final little poll to get a sense of how people found the webinar and what you learned, because it really, really helps us in terms of figuring out ways we can improve and learning and just getting a sense, because we're not all together in a room, which is a huge pity, getting a sense of how people enjoyed it. It's really, really, we really appreciate that feedback, so you should be able to take part. So thank you all so much for joining us. I think we can all agree it was fascinating. I know there's a lot of questions we didn't come to, but we will share those resources again tomorrow, so hopefully some of them will be answered, and I don't think this will be the last time that we'll be talking about this issue. And we'll also share the links that you mentioned, Patrick, around the climate camp and the events coming up as well, in-person events. Jane, do you want to close with anything?
No, I think that this is wonderful. We've long been wanting to do something around this topic. It's been something that we've been touching on the fringes, and other groups that you've already named have been kind of taking action, doing resistance. We've been doing a lot of support work like through Rosie and her role as narrative development coordinator with BO, supporting kind of local activists and groups resisting and putting in objections to a lot of these new data centers. So it's been really fascinating figuring out how are we kind of developing this, because it is kind of an ever-changing landscape. I think we've had the timely opportunity, with the recent data released in the CSO around this, and I think this really is starting to ignite a bit of a conversation. It's certainly something we're approached on quite often when we go out and do workshops, when we're doing tabling like in universities or at different events. So we really encourage people to try and join us next week as well for that workshop. I know that a couple of people have already been in touch saying that they're organising kind of local events, and they're going to just join, and get a group of people together. And I think if you've enjoyed the conversation tonight and it stimulated some thought, maybe consider doing that. Ask people in your family or some friends to join you and log in and join us for the workshop next week, to allow kind of further discussion where you are to happen, because I think that these are conversations that we need to have. We need to better understand them and feel more confident in having those discussions, finding those connections, and really taking a systems change approach to this, which I think is really the resounding takeaway I'm taking from these wonderful presentations that you both gave this evening. We really need to stop focusing on that individual responsibility, look at corporate responsibility and accountability in relation to this, because the kind of world and the energy transition that we want to see isn't one that's still, steeped in corporate capture. So I think that, yeah, we want to challenge those power imbalances and those inequities. So I think you've given us an awful lot of food for thought. And yeah, really looking forward to continuing this conversation with all those who took part this evening, and with both of you as well. So yeah, thank you, and a massive thank you to Rosie for organising tonight. It was really, really well put together. So thank you so much.
No problem. I'm going to close it off now, and I wish us all a lovely evening.
Thanks so much, Rosie. Thanks so much, Emma Jane.
No problem. Thank you,
Thanks
guys.
both. Yeah.
See everyone. Bye.
Bye.